Hello and welcome to QuestionDine, the show where parliamentary candidates sit down to dinner with WORLDwrite volunteers to discuss some of the big issues that confront society today. My name's Tom Slater, I'm assistant editor at the online magazine Spiked, and I'm chairing today's discussion in the E5 Square Cafe in Hackney, East London. Today what we want to do is to inject some big ideas, some big questions into the discussion away from the small p political and policy concerns to really look at what is really at stake in this election. So to kick us off, if we could meet our candidates.
I'm Charlotte George and I'm with the Green Party. You may notice from my accent that I am an immigrant. I first got involved in politics in Australia, and it was around asylum seeker and refugee issues. And then I moved here about 6.5 years ago and went, oh, look, it's no better here. Asylum seekers and refugees are treated appallingly here as well. And that was what got me involved in politics generally, and that was what drew me to the Green Party specifically. The Green Party specifically, I think, is offering a real alternative to people in terms of a real change in the philosophy and a vision for our country. We're thinking about what society do we all want to live in the future, and what can we be investing in and building now that's going to help us, our children, our grandchildren, and well into the future. So that's why I'm here.
So I was born in London and I live in Hoxton. As I was growing up, my family fostered a number of children from difficult situations at home. And that really taught me the importance of opportunity and aspiration to young people to make sure they get the best start in life. I'm a firm believer in the conservative ideological values of freedom, fairness, equality of opportunity. And my priorities for Hackney are three things. Firstly, housing. It's such a huge issue in Hackney now. We need more homes. That includes social housing, family homes, affordable housing. Secondly, better provision of youth services. Thirdly, I want to help local businesses. So many of the positive changes we've seen in Hackney over the last 5 years have been thanks to businesses starting up or moving to Hackney, creating jobs, creating opportunity, and giving people the comfort of a wage packet at the end of each month.
So I started out as, a union member and a Labour guy. I think generally in life, as you go through life, you become more conservative. After about 5 years of being a Labour and a trade unionist, I didn't like the way that the unions were controlling the Labour Party. I became a Liberal Democrat, and I've been a Liberal Democrat for the last 30-odd years, 35 years in fact. I think a lot of people, have listened to the rhetoric of UKIP. And as a Lib Dem, they're racists, they're horrible, they're bigots, and all of that sort of stuff. But I had a maths teacher at school that used to say to me, there's nothing so ignorant as a closed mind. And I just remember thinking, I'm going to listen to this guy called Nigel Farage. And I started to pay attention and listen to what he was saying. And I've realised now that this whole thing of being in Europe, being a part of the political union, which is the European Union, where we are governed by unelected commissioners who are basically pulling all the strings behind the MEPs. I thought there was something wrong with that. So I started to have an open mind, to listen to Farage, and all I can say to people is that I think we have to control immigration. I'm not saying stop it, I'm not saying ban it, I don't think the party is saying that, but we do have to control the quality and the quantity of the people that come here. That's how we begin to generate the money that we need to fix the problems of the country.
What really spurred me on is housing, and also I'm sponsoring quite a lot around monetary reform. So that's my motivation. Thirdly, ethnic minority people involved in politics. Historically, there's been the assumption that you're only here for university and then you're going to go away and leave. And obviously that's not people's lives. People come here to university and they stay. Not a problem. So for me, it's about how do we engage these people? How do we engage? I was a young person once, of course I was. I do not remember not one party wanting to engage me in that political process. And as I've got older, I understand why. They want to make the decisions, and you, as voters, get to choose the options. And I'm against that. I'm saying, no, don't just choose the options, come and make the decisions. That's what I say. And fourthly, I do quite a lot around promoting the vote for 16 plus. Essentially, in my book, no taxation without representation. I don't know, I'm not aware if you know it, but it's obviously part of American history. And the idea is that we take tax from you at 16, but we don't give you a voice until you're 18. I feel, I have strong values, and I feel that's unacceptable. I feel that 16, 17 should have the vote. If they don't know how to use the vote, that's fine, they just don't have to use it. That if we had more young people voting, the policies that are available for you to choose from today would look a lot different.
So I have this belief that the fairer a society is, and the more that we work by narrowing equality of opportunities for the people who have a lot to those who have a little, the better all of society is. I think the better well off we are, I think the fairer we are, the more just we are. And I think that core belief comes from where I grew up. I grew up in Chingford. I had two incredibly hard-working immigrant parents who made sure that I could speak English better than they could. They made sure I went to school and learnt because they wanted more for me than they had. And I one day went to my careers advisor and said, I think I want to be a lawyer, and almost got laughed out of the room because of that sense of, you're not from the right place, you won't be able to do this. But with the help of the teachers and parents and my community, there was this idea of social mobility, that I could work to do well. So I went to university, became a lawyer, I broadened my horizons, and I travelled the world. If we allow people the access to places that they want to go in life, they will do well, but also businesses and wider society will do well. And it's those principles that made me and led me to the Labour Party. I'm running, and this is the first time I'm running, because about 5 or 10 years ago, I looked around the political spectrum, I looked at debates, I didn't recognise anybody. I saw them, but I didn't recognise them. They may even be saying things that I agreed with, but they didn't feel like I connected with them. And I think also this election is a really good opportunity for younger people and everyone to say, actually, let's have an honest conversation about immigration, about how we want the NHS to be run, and about what we actually believe. And I think this is the one time that politicians will really genuinely listen. So if you're disenchanted, this is probably the one good time for you to stand up and say something about your voice.
So for me, this is the second general election I'll be voting in where all of the kind of political discourse is obsessed with this kind of quite technocratic idea of the budget deficit. And I think that this kind of restricts the terms of the debate to kind of taxing and spending. So I kind of want to hear your big visions for the economy of this country, and how do we kind of deal with the longer term problems we face, like low productivity, low wages, and low exports.
This might be an interesting one for you, Jack, because it's about David Cameron mostly. He's made some disastrous decisions under the name of humanitarianism to do with in Libya and more recently Syria. And I just wanted to ask, I'm very concerned that how many times does it have to be proven that these kind of erratic interventions aren't an improvement for either UK interests or the countries that we're invading?
We do have a redistribution of wealth in this country, from the poor to the rich, quantitative easing, and I haven't had any party oppose this. So if you guys got elected, what would you do about it?
My question is on the EU. I am pro-Euro, but I'm anti-EU. And the reason why I'm anti-EU is because I find it undemocratic. I find that it's a project that was created by an elite that has a real contempt for the European electorate. But I also think that there is another problem with the EU, which is that it lets governments off the hook and it allows them to pursue politics that are completely insulated. You know, they don't bother to debate with us. They just do it behind our backs. They come up with their laws and ideas, and I find that extremely undemocratic. So isn't it time that we just get rid of the EU and take the public a bit more seriously if we actually care about democracy, sovereignty, and listen more to people's will?
You're my perfect candidate, you are.
So there's
lovely Europe.
So there's a lot on the table there. We've got the economy, we've got humanitarian intervention, quantitative easing, and should we just get the hell out of the EU? So the candidates don't feel the need to come back on everything, perhaps take one question and just explore it.
Essentially, the Green Party absolutely think we need a redistribution of wealth, and we are unafraid to use the word taxation and to mean progressive taxation. And there are much better ways that we can be taxing wealth in this country. The rich are getting richer. So the idea that there is no money, which we keep getting told all the time, there's no money, that's why we need austerity. That's not true. There is money. We just need to be clever about finding ways of making sure that money gets to the people who actually need it. Essentially, we believe in investment now and not austerity. So we believe that GDP is not an accurate way of reflecting how the economy is doing. There are much better ways of reflecting how we're doing as a society. We believe in prosperity, not growth, and also thinking about the environment as well and factoring that into our economics.
I mean, briefly on Libya and Syria, I absolutely agree. It's a tragedy to look at the situation these countries are in. I wouldn't suggest that we should be treating any of them as a one-size-fits-all, though. I wouldn't say that that means we should ever rule out ever doing any kind of international activities like that. But absolutely, we must learn lessons from them, and we must ensure that the reasons for any intervention are correct and that we fully understand the situation we might be entering. In terms of the economy, I agree it's a shame that we have to spend so much focus on the budget. You know, we had such a difficult position left by Labour at the time of the last election, that so much of the government's time has been spent on trying to rectify that, on turning the country around, on boosting jobs.
Sorry, excuse me. Can we have an honest discussion? It wasn't just Labour. Labour had the purse strings, yes, but there was downturns in other countries too, so please can we...
Well, there were downturns in other countries,
but... mudslinging and try and engage in the conversation.
I think it'd be wrong to suggest that this was just a global issue and therefore, you know, no one was to blame and everything was done as well as it could be in the UK. I think that would be a mistake.
But I'm just trying to be very clear. Sorry.
I completely agree with your point that we need to now move on from that. We need to think about what the economy is going to be going forward. Quantitative easing needs to be redressed and needs to be brought back in. It has effects that are unusual and are not beneficial for the long-term economy. And I agree that we need to be focusing on what next to make our society more productive. Personally, I think things like apprenticeships and the growth we've seen over the last 5 years is absolutely key. We now have twice as many people every year starting apprenticeships in London as 5 years ago. And it's that kind of thing which is going to make our workforce more flexible.
Well, I guess for me, it really takes a real change in what kind of industries we promote, because you can't, we're kind of so focused on the service sector, and you can't make the service sector that much more efficient. There are only so many ways you can make a coffee, and there are only so many ways you can offer like legal advice and accountancy. So what is the kind of the new industry that we need to kind of get behind, or how are we going to change society in this way? Yeah, but I get that and I understand that, but taxing people doesn't change that kind of the output.
So I think it's actually a wider question. I don't think it's a what's the new industry for us. It's about our view on education and where young people go.
If you look back since 1970s, right, you can see that our economy is becoming increasingly financialized, and that's the problem. That's why we're here. We're having all this economic crisis, and so my question is, I don't want to know who's going to cut where, and I want to know where you're going to invest. I want to know what kind of projects and infrastructure you're going to offer us. I want to know those big ideas.
Can I take your point?
Rather than taxing the rich. I don't want everyone I don't want the standards to be brought down. I want everyone to be brought up. So the poor to be rich. Because one of my famous slogans is Ferraris for all, which means the best for everyone, rather than all of us be poor. We want all of us to be rich.
Well, I hear you. I think there needs to be a reality check, and I don't want to be the doom and gloom here, but the reality is a flexible employment market means that we are essentially, someone has to be poor. And my argument is, do we need to be this poor? For a 21st century country, do we need to be this poor? That's my argument.
Do we necessarily need to be poor? Does someone need to be poor?
The current economic system, a flexible employment market, breeds poor people, and someone has to get the short straw. Okay, and in terms of being born, I got the short straw, and I wasn't too happy about it. And when you realise there's this fantastic egalitarian dream, you work hard and you get rewarded, and then it didn't matter how much I worked hard, I still didn't get rewarded. So you take that and you think, well, what is it? And it comes back down to the bigger picture, which I think someone said over here. The economic structures that we have, and you mentioned financial markets. So monetary policy in this country, if I'm correct, is 1890 is the last time we looked at it. And that was when we decided it wasn't a bad idea for banks to be making our money. That's when we decided that. As a consequence, more banks came along and more banks made money. For you and I, that has an impact because all the banks are throwing all the money at housing, which means you and I don't stand a chance of getting it. because all the banks are throwing all the money there instead of, like the Green Party say, investing. So as part of the policies that I strongly suggest people sign to as well in the Green Party. And I've been bringing this up for debate. It's not just taxing the rich, it's also looking at that banking system. When Mark Carney, the Bank of England, sat on national television and said to the Select Committee, he does not have the tools to run our housing market. When your bank of your country says they cannot run the market, shouldn't we have been alarm bells going off once? But no, we just calm and said, oh, it doesn't have any tools.
What I was addressing was, first of all, the point that you mentioned about quantitative easing. It's a fraud. When you print money, it means that the people that have already put money in the bank and think that their savings were worth so much, you devalue everybody else's pound in the bank. The problem is that we have a fiscal divide between the haves and have-nots. Yeah? So it means that the more you've got, the more you can get, and the more you can earn, and the more you can keep. The country is maxed out on its credit card. We are in debt. And every year, we spend more money than we earn. What is worse, and a point on foreign policy now, what is worse is that we give away money to foreign regimes that actually, a lot of it is going to corrupt people, Robert Mugabe, for example, where a massive amount of foreign aid investment is going. So just on Marissa's point there, I love Marissa to bits. I want her as a candidate because I think she encapsulated perfectly. No, look, what she said was she loves Europe but hates the EU. I am absolutely 100% behind that concept. I love Europe. I am not a xenophobe. A lot of people have said, oh, you're xenophobic. I embrace people of all cultures. I meet and greet in about 17 languages. I've extensively travelled the world. Part of my job is travelling the world, training foreign policemen. So I want to be great neighbours with the EU, but I don't want to be governed by an unelected, undemocratic controlling party and the commissioners that pull all the strings. This country sits at the centre of global telecoms connectivity. All of the fibre cables that connect the UK to Europe and connect the USA and North America to Europe all come through London. They're all switched through London. But we've done very little to exploit all of that connectivity in London where it's all switched. Now, what we need to be doing is connecting our cities, our towns, our villages. We need to be closing the digital divide. Nobody's done that. No politician that I know has come up with a cohesive plan that says, do you know what, we need to enable and facilitate all of our towns and villages.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we deal with hate speech in this country. And you know, do we think that sweeping things under the carpet, censoring them, for example, is an effective way of actually dealing with hate? Or is it just, you know, showing that we're doing something without really doing anything? How can we actually address the problem?
How are you going to combat the issue of British citizens going abroad to Syria to fight for ISIS, children as young as 16 doing that?
I would like to know, from all the party candidates, do you think that we will be a big loss to the EU if we leave?
So obviously Labour are against a EU referendum, against pushing out a referendum. So why do you think this should be taken off the table then?
Sure. So to clarify, what the position for Labour is that they're not promising a referendum unless any more powers are taken from the UK to Brussels, in which case we would. I think the wider question is what would happen if we left? And I understand that we talked earlier about loving Europe and not loving the EU. I, however, do think fundamentally that core ideal of having a union of European states working together both politically and economically, in the corest sense, actually brings a lot of benefits. I do accept that over the past 10 or 15 years we have seen this sense of what we call, it's a political phrase, but this democratic deficit. There is a disconnection between you voting and me voting in our European elections and then going to the Commission. Just as a person who likes democracy, I think that that's been lost. However, the fundamental core of that, and staying with that, I think is vitally important. I think on its best day and its best terms, it provides us more opportunities, it allows us freedom of movement, it can do better with trade. And I think for those reasons would strengthen reform. Would they regret us leaving? I think absolutely the answer is yes. Being the question of ISIS and young people leaving here. A lot of people say, well, it's a question of, oh, they feel disenfranchised or disenchanted. A lot of them, it's a question of identity. And this is a question, and it goes on to, I think, integration. What Britain is at its best is when it's fully integrated. And I think in the past 10 or 15 years, the lines have been blurred between what is a multiracial society and an integrated society. On hate speech, there's never going to be a right answer. It's a question of one person's right to freedom to express themselves freely versus another person's right not to be offended. I personally think the more open conversations we have and shedding things into the light is a more robust way of dealing with hate generally. And I think that that's the best way of nullifying some of these counter-extremists and extremists out there.
But if the question is, should hate speech be silenced then?
So I think the answer is,
what essentially is your position?
The balance of
hate
it,
speech
sure.
legislation?
The balance of it is where it's inciting further radicalisation or hatred.
I kind of touched on it briefly earlier, but to what extent do you feel as though immigrants have become scapegoats pretty much for all the problems that are really occupying British citizens today? So, by example, should we say the economy, crime, even housing to a certain extent?
I am for open borders. I believe that everyone should be free to circulate around the world. I think Labour, unfortunately, over the last, I would say, 50 years, has not done much for that, although they often present as being pro-immigration. We saw that in 2006, for example, they treated Romanians and Bulgarians as second-class citizens. So I have my doubts about your
I don't disagree.
stance.
Well, personally, I am pro-immigration.
Let me say right out to back that I actually agree with Charlotte and the Greens in terms of if you fast forward it 1,000 years, we should have no borders whatsoever around the world, right? The issue of borders comes down to the financial disparity between countries, and you can't just throw the gates open and allow people who can only earn $5 a day to come here and earn $50 a day. Why can't you do that? The reason you can't do that is because you get a lot of people who are saying, hey, the land of opportunity is whichever is the country where they can go and earn more. And that's precisely what has happened with Romania. Why do you think so many people want to come here? Because we're such a generous nation, and we have been for a very long time. We're famous for it. You know, in an ideal world, we should have no borders. But the practicality is, and we live in the real world, not in, I don't want to use the word cloud cuckoo land, but you know, we are not in the ideal world. We are not yet in utopia.
Pete,
we haven't fixed all the problems.
Can I say something on that? The problem is that politicians are unable, I mean, this immigration debate is all situated within a discourse of limits. Politicians often see resources as finite, as you know, immigrants are coming in and they're only taking out of the economy. But immigrants come in and they give much more than they take away.
That.
And for me is that politicians should be focusing on how to create a bigger cake so that everyone that comes in gets a much bigger pie.
I love your analogy of the Ferrari for everyone.
Yeah,
absolutely
but
love
the problem
it.
is that the politicians are unable to provide that vision, to produce more. So what they do is that they use the immigrants as scapegoats. That's the problem.
And if at this point could bring in Charlotte, it'd be very interesting to hear your perspective on this, because I know the Green Party are this election present themselves as being very pro-immigration, but picking up on Marissa's point, there is this issue of limits, of saying there's only finite resources,
yes,
which seems to some extent to be a Green perspective. How do you marry those two things, being pro-immigration, but also in the broader sense, admitting and saying openly that you think there are limits to what we can provide, to what we can...
Well, there are a couple of things to say. One is in terms of living in cuckoo land or an ideal world. The Greens believe we should be aiming higher. There's something that really frustrates me is going, oh, well, that's an idealistic thing. We do agree, though, that one of the issues is the disparity in wealth between different nations, but therefore we wouldn't be cutting our aid to other countries, and we would also be looking at, you know, fairer ways of doing trade, and that's not necessarily free trade.
But on this point of growth in particular, because it seems like if, as Marissa was saying, if you want to be able to include more and more people in this country, then therefore you have to make the cake bigger. If you say that, as you did at the beginning, that you're actually anti-growth, how are you even going to achieve it?
Well, what Marissa was saying was also there are finite resources in the world, and that's why we think eternal growth, it's just not something to aim for. I guess it's to do with what you're actually aiming for. We don't aim for caps on immigration figures, and we don't aim for growth as our ultimate outcome. What we aim for is prosperity and investment in people.
The difference that I see is when I'm in Europe and I go to universities there and colleges there, they're advertising jobs, and they're advertising jobs in all of the other European countries. And when I come home to my own country, jobs, career pathways are advertised just here. That's quite limited. It is.
But Tina, if I may pick up specifically, I mean, if we're talking about what we might lose, is there not also a case about what we might gain? We've already talked about the democratic deficit, but I think it goes even more deeper than that. When you've got countries like Greece, who, when things started to go to pot, you essentially had EU bureaucrats move in and take over their whole government. I mean, is there not something to gain? Do we not lose sovereignty, essentially?
No, you do not lose sovereignty in the EU. No, that's
despite the fact that
you don't
laws
lose
are made outside of.
You do not lose sovereignty in the EU. In fact, countries, it's very, very rarely that countries can lose sovereignty. I'm
so
sorry.
what happened to Greece then? And
very, very rarely.
Where
So
the government was taken aside so that a technocrat could go and sort the economic crisis. Because they don't trust the people and elected government.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, but you do not lose sovereignty. What you might lose your administration for a period, but you do not lose sovereignty. No country, Greece is not suddenly ungreased. Greece has actually been at the table and it's been negotiating.
We've already had a question about ISIS. We've also had a question about limiting speech. And one thing that the current Tory-led coalition has been very much at the forefront of is limiting speech, particularly on university campuses as well as in schools, to try and tackle this issue of radicalisation. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because in many ways it seems like some of the most extreme restrictions on free speech in the academy in particular that we've seen in some time. So do you really think that actually trying to silence these preachers, trying to surveil these students is actually the best way in stopping people going on something like ISIS?
You know, absolutely. I see where the point of your question is coming from, and I'm a huge supporter of free speech. But unfortunately, I believe that there are vulnerable people out there, and with the most extreme views, they should be restricted, even if, as you say, it's on a university campus.
But who are these vulnerable people? Because it seems like in this discussion about free speech, we often get down to, we've already heard about dog whistle politics, it's always about this kind of mass out there who are slightly less rational than we are, perhaps slightly less educated than we are. Who are these vulnerable people, effectively?
The flippancy with which you didn't really address the subject of Libya and Syria in terms of that kind of thing, in terms of the fact that we believe in some way that we understand the internal nuances of that country better than the people within it. What do you say to that?
Well, I disagree. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say I understand the nuances of Libya or Syria.
Do you think David Cameron does?
Well, I'm sure he had, you know, very well-advised people who were, you know, inputted into that discussion. But I don't know the background of the decision, unfortunately. In terms of my concern over hate speech, it's that giving them a platform, an official platform like that, legitimizes it. So if you have a radical preacher at a university campus and it's an event that's put together by the university or the Students' Union, then that, as I say, legitimizes it and makes people think that this is a reasonable viewpoint to hold, a reasonable way of life in modern British society, which I disagree with.
Whether we agree with it, whether we disagree with it, and discuss it openly. We can't do that if we can't hear it.
That's a great point, and in fact, a lot of our candidates have actually been refused when we've written off and requested, can we come and address the students? A lot of them, the students' unions particularly, have basically said, no, you can't come here, we'll block it. So, you know, it's kind of, it should be the same on both sides. We should all be able to sit around a table and have an open, as Bilal said, an open and honest conversation about the problems facing this country.
Would you then extend that to the people that we're talking about here, which is radical preachers, hate? Do you think they should have, as you think UKIP should have a platform on the university campus, do you think they should as well?
I'm a passionate defender of free speech. There comes a point, though, where who basically are fighting for Sharia law in the UK. Now, I support the idea of free speech, but there comes a point, as Bilal said, and I do agree with Bilal, there comes a point where free speech starts to invoke and incite.
My question concerns housing, and I think it's obvious that there is a lot of new homes that need to be built, but I would like to discuss whether you're willing to consider rethinking planning laws to take away your control over housing being built and to give it back to people that probably will do a better job at making affordable housing for themselves.
There are currently 435 prohibition zones in London where dogs, alcohol, unauthorised leafleting and public assemblies are banned. I would like to know how you intend to curb excessive everyday life regulations.
Excellent. And to pick up with Charlotte, I'd be particularly interested on the housing issue. This has been a big headline thing for the Greens, obviously subject of a quite tremendous gaffe as well, but nevertheless, so what do you think needs to be done about housing? Do we need to just build more and more and more? What?
No, well, we think that basically there's not one thing and that you have to work on a number of levels, and that social housing needs to be the focus, because that is the end of the market where there's almost nothing, and that's not being replenished. And it, you know, I mean, anyone who lives around here, they're all luxury flats everywhere you go, all the new developments. So that's why we have the policy about building 500,000 socially rented homes. These would be, you know, these are not going into the private sector to make money for private landlords. That's across the UK. I mean, part of our economic policies are actually about not being so London-centric, because that actually, you know, although we all live in London, well, I'm assuming everyone here lives in London, you know, it actually is beneficial for us and for people outside of London if we can start looking to spread the wealth across the whole country, because it's part of the reason why housing is so expensive here.
People that want to live in London, you want to push them to another place.
No, it's not about pushing people.
I think there is. I think what he's trying to say, if you don't mind me interjecting, is that there's a London problem, which is not shared in the rest of the UK. So the rest of the UK have other housing needs, which is why I think Charlotte mentioned that it's a multifaceted approach to the situation. There's not just one tool that's going to answer the housing problem. You do find places like Nottingham, real radical places. They're developing, they've got regeneration going, but their gentrification includes social development, whereas our gentrification, especially in Hackney, excludes social development, i.e. the social people who are renting socially are being shifted out.
And Tina, if I might pick you up on Shalane's point, I mean, as a representative of the Liberal Democrats, the party that is at least nominally supposed to be about freedom, about individual responsibility, how do you feel about the extent of the regulations in terms of trying to nudge people out of smoking, out of drinking, the regulation of public places, which seems to have just gone up and up recently? I mean, what is your perspective?
I think my perspective is, I'm going to put my criminology hat on here and say a lot of the regulation has come from, if I can say it correctly, 3,160 new pieces of legislation which popped up on our society in a very short period of time. I'm not going to say when, it's obvious. It came in a very short period of time. Now, for me, suddenly behaviours that I did as a child, you no longer have the liberty to do. Now, I've got to admit I was a young person, and I'm sure I had my bottle of vodka at some point. I think it is a terrible way to handle things. I think there's nothing wrong, and I'm going to use some examples from New Zealand, for example, where social spaces can be contested spaces or they can be negotiated. And I'd rather go with negotiation.
On your point about finite resources, I didn't say there are finite resources. What I was trying to say, that we can create more. So extra pair of hands, more immigration means creating a bigger cake. Not that I like your party. I don't agree that resources are finite.
Well, there are some resources that are finite. Well, there are some resources, like, you know, actual coal and water. And there are actually some finite resources in the world.
Yeah, but that's when we have to innovate and create and find other resources. Like fracking, for example. That's
I just wanted to go back to the thing about Muslims and extremism and, you know, being invited to see hate speak and stuff like that. I think there's a really kind of dangerous assumption that if someone is kind of presented with a dangerous idea, they'll kind of absorb it uncritically.
And there's actually a lack of belief in people's maturity to, challenge backward ideas in public. The problem is that the politicians don't trust us.
I was just agreeing with Marissa. It's about trusting the people to hear at things that they can disagree with, and giving them the freedom to disagree with things. And, you know, it's not about hiding it and silencing people, because then there is no arena for discussion. There's no arena for a range of ideas.
Banning someone doesn't make them go away, it just drives them underground where we then can't engage with them at all.
Yes. Okay, so we've got a sentence each from each of our candidates, so just your final thought, what you want to leave us with in one sentence, please.
Okay, well, I guess, like I've been saying, that the Green Party is a party about the long-term vision and about actually being hopeful and trying to have some trust in people and have trust that we can create a better world together, and not not finding scapegoats and not finding reasons not to do things that we know are going to be better for us and the world.
I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think it really shows why East London is such an exciting place to live. A real brilliant range of opinions. And I hope that you're all going to consider the Conservative Party as a progressive party that will continue doing good work and put the country in a great place in 5 years' time.
Thank you. So I'd just like to say thank you all for organising this evening. It's been brilliant. I beg you to keep an open mind. do your own research, make up your own minds. I didn't spend 35 years as a Liberal to suddenly become a racist bigot overnight. So, you know, please understand, I'm convinced, do your own research and make up your own minds. Don't listen to everything.
I want to say thank you very much for the invite, and like someone's mentioned, I trust you. So I'm not going to tell you to vote for a political party. What I am going to say to you is voteforpolicies.org. Yeah, it's a tool on the internet. Use that tool and make up your own minds and vote according to what you believe in. And I'm convinced that once you read through those policies which will dictate the rest of our, well, the next 5 years of our lives, that's the decision you're making, not about personalities or parties or colours. It's the policies for the next 5 years. That should determine your decision. I've given you a tool on how to make that happen for yourselves.
So thanks for the invite, it's been great. For anybody around the table who feels that politics isn't for them or they don't feel connected to the election, this is the one opportunity in a generation to really put us as politicians to the test, because there's so many of us. It is a great opportunity for you to be involved in any which party you go, because it's important and vital for you to be part of the system than not. So I urge you all to go and vote.
And that's all we've got time for here on QuestionDine. I'd like to say a big thank you both to our candidates, to our volunteers, but also to the E5 Square Cafe and for you for watching. Thank you.